My name is Howard Nusbaum. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Chicago, the Stella M. Rowley Professor of Psychology. I'm also the Master of the Social Sciences Collegiate Division, Deputy Dean for the Social Sciences Division, and Director of the Center for Practical Wisdom. I'm the principal investigator on the Preaching and Neuroscience Project with the Catholic Theological Union. So our new project with the Catholic Theological Union, which we're calling Compelling Preaching, is basically intended to understand several things about the process of Catholic preaching, where Catholic preaching is preaching a homily in church. The homily conveys a Bible-related story, but also has a message, a theme, and an attempt to, or an intent to, affect the listeners in various ways. And the goal of the project is to try to understand how does preaching affect audiences, listeners, and how do we characterize that? How can we characterize it in such a way as to help teachers of preaching help preachers become better at what they do, and to do this both for English and Spanish in the United States. So the compelling preaching question is really about how language has impact on the listener. And when a preacher is preaching a homily in church, the preacher wants to have certain kinds of effects occur. Some of those are to increase trust or to increase optimism and hope, to be memorable, to engage the listener, and to engage the listener so that their interest tracks the story that is being told on the one hand, or the narrative, but at the same time to get them engaged sort of emotionally and socially. And people have been studying the science of language understanding for a long time. Language understanding requires understanding the speech that is being spoken, the consonants and vowels that are being uttered, the tone of voice and how they inflect what they're saying as a speaker, and how that inflection, whether the tone goes up or the tone goes down, how that grabs the listener and helps them track and follow the story and interpret what is being said. And so we're using the science of the psychology of language, the psychology of memory, how we understand narratives and stories, and using behavioral methods to try to assess that, where we ask questions: what did you hear, what did you understand, what did you like? But we also are intending to measure sort of brain responses. So putting electrodes on a person's scalp, we can record the electrical activity in your brain and essentially get a picture of how your brain is processing the information that corresponds to the choices and determinations that you make as a listener for the speech you're hearing. One aspect of what we're doing in trying to understand how the listener is engaged by the material is that notion of engagement. What does it mean to be deeply involved in a story or a narrative or a homily that's being told? And one aspect of it is your attention is directed to the words and the messages that are being said. And you may be aroused by it, you may be excited, you may be even perhaps a little sad, but that's a form of arousal too. And the question is, how do you measure that arousal? And it's certainly the case that your brain will reflect some aspects of that arousal, and we know what those electrical signatures look like. But another aspect is that your pupil in your eye increases in diameter as you get engaged or aroused by material you're listening to, when you focus your attention on it. And so we can measure that using special devices called eye tracking systems that allow us to measure where you're looking, in this case where you're just listening, how much your pupil has expanded, which reflects how aroused and engaged you are. So we can measure aspects of attention and arousal, how engaged you are in the material, how it affects you emotionally with scalp electrodes, and measure the electrical activity of your brain. But at the same time, we want to be able to measure something that is closer to your behavioral responses. And to do that, we measure pupillary dilation. How wide is your pupil? When I went to graduate school, I wrote a personal statement that basically said, I have no interest in studying anything smaller than a quarter second of speech. I'm interested in understanding the stories and how they're understood by listeners, the stories that people tell about themselves. And when I was a graduate student, I got to study vowels, which are about 100 milliseconds or less in length. So it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I can actually study the kinds of stories that affect listeners. A lot of the work in the psychology of language, the science of the psychology of language, is focused on how we derive meaning from a set of words and sentences. How do we understand the meaning? One of the things that was really important to me as a scientist was an experience I had as a graduating undergraduate, where the speaker at my graduation was Barbara Jordan, a congresswoman from Texas. She gave an incredible speech that had me wanting to join the government. She talked about public service. It changed me in the moment. Now, of course, I didn't go into government, and it didn't change my life, but it did have an effect. And that effect, that impact on me, I think is important. It is not studied specifically by science of language. And that's one of the things that we want to study. By choosing preaching homilies that are actually intended to affect people, to mobilize their social concerns, to have them go out in the world and do good, or just to care about the people in their community, that's an impact. And understanding that scientifically is a critical aspect of what language is really for, not just understanding the meaning of a sentence, but having it affect you. And that's where I think the important science is here. Some, I guess, decades ago now, when I first got involved with the Templeton Foundation, I learned a very interesting perspective that Sir John Templeton had about the relationship between science and religion. The Templeton Foundation was very concerned about being able to support science that was related to religion, but it wasn't really about religion. It was about what Sir John called spirituality. And the notion that he had about spirituality is that you increase spirituality by understanding humans and the world better. So on the one hand, there is this kind of tension that exists, or people fabricate between science and religion, in the sense that, science is disproving the existence of God, or science is basically telling us a story about the world that's in conflict with the Bible. But science is about understanding the world and ourselves, and the relationship to religion depends on the religion in part, and how one has to be defensive or not defensive about what one learns. Certainly the Dalai Lama is very supportive of the notion that science informs us in various ways. Many religious scholars are grounded in and interested in science. The Vatican has an office of science, actually. I think the work that we're doing is not about religion per se, but about how certain kinds of language changes the way we are as people, in our feelings and our attitudes and our beliefs and our behavior. And that's important to the Catholic Church. That's important to anybody who preaches. That's important to politicians who give speeches. But it's really important because it's about human understanding of language and its impact, and that's important to religion. One of the views of wisdom is that it's something sort of intrinsic in us. It emerges as a function of age. And that's a notion of the wise person. But at the Center for Practical Wisdom, we take a perspective that in the next moment, anybody could be a little wiser. Some experience could happen, some belief, some knowledge could change the way you view the next situation you're engaged in. By virtue of that change, you could act a little more wisely. I think that when we started the center, our view was that experiences change us, and maybe the accrual of those experiences might make us a wiser person. But just getting wiser in the next moment is important. One of the kinds of experiences that's really important that we know about is the effect of language on people in various ways. So, for example, there was a study run at the center where we exposed people to language from loving kindness meditation, and we found that increased empathy. Experiences like that, listening to a certain kind of language and then having more humility about yourself, that is what you know and what you don't know, or being able to take someone else's perspective for a moment, just to think about what's important to them. Those are things that advance your reasoning to be a little bit wiser. And homilies are intended to do that by increasing your sense of optimism, by increasing your sense of what another person's life might be like, what their concerns are like. A homily can change the way you view the world, view other people, and view yourself. And in doing so, has the opportunity, perhaps, to make you a little bit wiser. So in starting this project, trying to understand the impact of homilies and how to make a better homily or a better preacher of homilies, we need to know what a compelling homily is. So in the very first year, in the beginning, we have to figure out what makes a homily compelling to some degree. And the place to start is, as with many psychology projects, to ask people what they think about a homily. So one of the ways we approach this is we get experts to say, give us a homily that's compelling, give us a homily that's not as compelling, and then if we present this to listeners, do they agree? And how does your religious background prepare you, change you, or change your expectations for what you hear in a homily? And so in this very first year, we're just trying to get our arms around the notion of what makes some homilies more compelling than others. What do experts think? Because those are the ones who teach homiletics. And what do listeners think? Because maybe the things that experts think they're doing is not being understood by the listeners in the same way. And in that way, we have an opportunity not just to help experts teach better homiletics, but to help them understand what their audiences are hearing and what they do, and to maybe define what it is about preaching that can have an effect on the listener. It's an interesting question to consider who is the recipient of a homily. So on the one hand, most preachers probably think about their audience, who are the constituents of their church, who comes as part of the congregation on a regular basis. And largely those are going to be, at least given the project that we have, those are going to be Catholics, mostly Catholics, probably going to church on a regular basis, and so they have an understanding and expectation of what homiletics is like. On the other hand, it's not necessarily the case any longer that every preacher is preaching to their congregation. They're posting podcasts of homilies. They're doing other kinds of social media. And so homilies are being received by a broader spectrum of audiences probably than ever in the past. And what that means is it's important for us to understand not just what, shall we say, the regular Catholic churchgoer considers as compelling in a homily, but is it universally compelling? Or is it more compelling to people who are Christian than non-Christian? Or is it compelling to everyone? And if it's compelling, what does that mean? Does it mean it's convincing everybody to go out and tithe at a Catholic church? Or to give of time and effort to the homeless in shelters? Or does it just mean to vote differently, even if voting is not being solicited? What are the things that happen for different groups listening to homilies? And one of the things we're trying to do in trying to define what a compelling homily is like is to understand sort of what the elements of the narrative or what the elements of the preaching are that affect people and its performance in delivery. So, for example, if I'm a dramatic speaker and I'm using my hands and I move around a lot, or if I'm just very sedate and very clear, does that make a homily more compelling? What we hope to have by the end of this project is a kind of list of some of the aspects of homilies in terms of how a story develops, how a message is presented, how it is delivered in terms of the performance, maybe what the role of music is, and how to give that kind of information to a preacher of homiletics or to a teacher of preaching in order to say, these are the things that your homilies should touch on. These are the ways in which you should talk and deliver the message. Here's how you might use music. And here's the things this kind of homiletic approach could affect people, and a different approach could affect people in a different way. People who teach homiletics have a lot of beliefs about what they do, but they don't have a lot of evidence that what they do is the thing they think it's doing. And one thing that we want to do is help teachers of homiletics understand what works and what doesn't work. And it might be that all of their beliefs are correct and we have empirical support for them. And then the next person who writes a book on how to do homiletics will have good evidence to support the arguments they make. It could be that some of the things they believe are not quite right, and we can inform them about how to improve what they're doing. And so our goal here is just to find out, how do homiletics work? How do homilies affect people? What is effective and maybe what is not so effective? And that can help teachers and preachers improve what they do.